The studio buzzed with energy as the cameras rolled and the bright lights illuminated the stage. Millions of viewers sat in their homes, watching their screens, waiting for the debate to begin. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made even the audience hold their breath. At the center of it all sat David Langford, a well-known liberal reporter, famous for his sharp questioning and aggressive tactics. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and leaned forward in his seat. His posture exuded confidence, perhaps too much confidence. Opposite him sat Karoline Leavitt, young but composed. Unlike David, she did not shift in her seat or adjust her papers nervously. She simply waited, calm and unreadable. She had been here before. She knew how this worked. The moderator gave a brief introduction, but nobody was really listening. The real battle was about to begin. David's lips curled into a slight smirk as he took the first shot. "Karoline, let's be honest," he began, his voice carrying the kind of forced politeness that only seasoned reporters could master. "The American people deserve the truth. Donald Trump has continuously missiled this country. Just last week, he claimed that under his presidency, the economy was stronger than ever. But let's face it, under Biden, unemployment is down, and wages are up. Isn't it time we stop pretending that Trump's policies were anything but disastrous?" The audience stirred. Some nodded in agreement, while others leaned forward, waiting for Karoline's response. David, convinced he had just cornered her, relaxed into his chair. Karoline, however, did not respond immediately. Instead, she sat there, her expression unreadable, her hands resting lightly on the desk in front of her. She did not blink. She did not frown. She did not rush to speak. A long, heavy silence filled the room. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. David shifted slightly. The silence stretched just enough to feel unnatural, just enough to make him uncomfortable. Karoline finally took a breath. "David," she said, her voice steady, controlled. "I appreciate the attempt, but let's not rewrite history." The audience stiffened. Even David's smirk wavered for a moment. "You're sitting here on national television, telling the American people that things are better under Biden." She tilted her head slightly, letting the weight of her words settle. "Let's talk about facts instead of feelings." David opened his mouth, ready to interrupt, but Karoline wasn't finished. She turned slightly towards the camera, fully aware of how this moment would play out later across social media. She knew exactly what she was doing. Under Trump, gas prices averaged $2.70 per gallon. She paused. Under Biden, Americans are struggling to pay over $4 in many states. A few murmurs spread through the audience. Inflation under Trump, less than 2%. Karoline continued, her tone measured but firm. Under Biden, it skyrocketed to over 9% at its peak. David's fingers curled slightly around the edges of his notes. His confidence wasn't as strong as it had been 2 minutes ago. Karoline folded her hands in front of her and leaned in slightly. "Now tell me, David, do those sound like improvements?" The camera zoomed in on David's face. For the first time, he hesitated. The air in the studio had shifted. David Langford was no longer in control. The easy confidence he had just minutes ago was starting to crack. The audience could feel it. Something had changed. David cleared his throat and sat up straighter. He couldn't afford to look weak on live television. Not now. Not against Karoline. "That's misleading, Karoline," he finally said, forcing a chuckle. "Inflation is a global issue, and let's not pretend Trump had no hand in setting up the economic downturn we saw when Biden took office. It was a weak attempt to regain control, and Karoline knew it. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she reached down, picked up a single sheet of paper, and held it up for everyone to see. "This," she said, "is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, December 2020, right before Biden took office." David's eyes flicked to the paper, but he didn't move. Inflation rate, 1.4%. Karoline's voice was calm, factual. That's not a setup for disaster, David. That's a stable economy. She turned the paper slightly, making sure the camera caught the numbers. Let the audience see it for themselves. Let the truth speak louder than words. Now let's look at January 2022, under Biden's leadership. She flipped to another page, 7.5%. The audience murmured. The tension grew. David shifted again, his hand curling around his pen. He opened his mouth, but Karoline wasn't done. Let's talk supply chains, David, she continued, flipping to another page. Since Biden took office, we've had record-breaking shortages, increased costs, and businesses struggling to stay afloat. David exhaled sharply through his nose. He needed to regain control, fast. Come on, Karoline. He leaned forward, forcing a smile. We both know the pandemic played a huge role in this. Trump didn't exactly leave behind a perfect economy. Karoline smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that said, I was waiting for you to say that. Oh, so now we're blaming COVID? She asked, tilting her head. Funny, because under Trump, despite the pandemic, the economy was still growing. GDP was rising. Jobs were returning. Small businesses were bouncing back. She paused just long enough for it to sink in. And then Biden came in, and everything fell apart. The audience was silent. David's jaw tightened. His fingers tapped restlessly against the desk. This was not how this was supposed to go. David Langford sat stiffly in his chair. The confidence that once oozed from his every word had evaporated. The bright studio lights, once his allies, now felt harsh and unforgiving. The audience's silence was no longer one of anticipation. It was judgment. They were watching him unravel. Across from him, Karoline Leavitt remained composed, her expression unreadable. She knew she had him. This wasn't arrogance. It was the certainty of someone who had prepared for this moment. She wasn't here to argue, she was here to expose. David cleared his throat, forcing a smile. Karoline, let's be honest. You're cherry-picking data to fit your narrative. Sure, gas prices are high, but that's a worldwide issue. Inflation, every country is dealing with it. The economy is complex, and pinning all of this on Biden is just political theater. Karoline didn't flinch. If anything, she looked even more confident. David, she said, her voice steady, let me ask you this. Who controlled the White House when inflation hit a 40-year high? Who was in charge when gas prices doubled? Who shut down the Keystone Pipeline on day one and triggered an energy crisis? David swallowed hard. He opened his mouth, but she wasn't done. Let's talk about the border crisis, she continued. Under Trump, illegal border crossings were at their lowest in decades. Under Biden, we've seen record-high crossings month after month. Crime is up, fentanyl is pouring into our cities, and working-class Americans are the ones paying the price. She leaned forward, her eyes locked onto him. So tell me, David, are these also global issues? Or is this just failed leadership? The question hit like a sledgehammer. David exhaled sharply, trying to mask his frustration. He needed a way out. A distraction. He'd forced a chuckle. Karoline, you're great at throwing out numbers. But let's talk about Trump himself. He's been indicted multiple times, he spreads misinformation, and let's not forget January 6th. Do you really think he's fit to lead again? For the first time, Karoline smiled. Not a forced smile, not an amused one, a knowing smile. Ah, she said, nodding slightly. There it is. David blinked. There what is? Karoline leaned back, crossing her arms. The moment you realized you couldn't debate me on the economy, on crime, or on Biden's failures. So you changed the subject. The audience murmured. David's face tensed. He knew she was right. You want to talk about Trump, she said. Fine. Let's talk about him. Let's talk about how, under his leadership, America had the strongest economy in decades. Let's talk about how wages were rising, not shrinking. Let's talk about how energy independence made gas cheap and how peace deals were being signed in the Middle East instead of endless wars. She tilted her head slightly. But you don't want to talk about that, do you? David opened his mouth, but she cut him off before he could speak. You want to focus on Trump's personality because you can't defend Biden's policies. The words hung in the air, crushing, undeniable. David shifted uncomfortably. His face was flushed now, his composure cracking. He was losing control of the debate, and everyone in the room knew it. The audience sat on the edge of their seats. Karoline had turned the tables completely. David Langford sat frozen. For the first time in his career, he had no comeback. The silence stretched across the studio. The once confident reporter, who prided himself on controlling the narrative, now sat exposed, speechless, and visibly unsettled. Millions were watching. Every camera in the studio captured his hesitation. Karoline Leavitt didn't press further. She didn't need to. The damage was done. She had won. A slow murmur spread through the audience. Some exchanged knowing glances, others whispered amongst themselves. Even the crew members, who had seen countless debates, felt the shift in power. David finally cleared his throat, gripping his papers as if searching for an escape. But there was none. The moderator, sensing the tension, attempted to move things along. David, do you have a response? David forced a smile. A weak, unconvincing attempt to regain control. Well, Karoline, I think we'll have to agree to disagree. A laugh rippled through the audience. Not because he had said something funny, but because it was the weakest defense he had ever given. Karoline simply tilted her head, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say anything. The audience had already made up their minds. David had come into this debate expecting to dominate. He thought he would frame Trump as a failure, Karoline as an apologist, and himself as the voice of reason. Instead, he had been outmatched, exposed, and most painfully, ignored. The moderator wrapped things up, thanking both guests. But as the cameras panned out, David knew what had just happened. The clips would go viral. Social media would tear him apart. His usual audience, who relied on him to control the narrative, would see him struggle for the first time. And Karoline, she had just cemented her reputation. As the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, David stood up, straightened his tie, and turned to Karoline. "You're good," he muttered, forcing a half smile. "Too good." Karoline just extended a hand, shaking his firmly. "Thanks, David, but I was just being honest." David chuckled dryly. Honesty. The one thing he had spent years twisting, spinning, and avoiding. And today, it had defeated him. The moment the cameras stopped rolling, the real storm began. David Langford left the studio quickly, avoiding eye contact with crew members who had just witnessed his most humiliating moment. He had no control over what came next. Karoline Leavitt, on the other hand, walked out with quiet confidence. She wasn't celebrating, she didn't need to. The facts had spoken for themselves. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Trending #1 on Twitter. David Langford gets destroyed on live TV. YouTube clips racking up millions of views within hours. News articles flooding in, some praising Karoline's composure, others scrambling to defend David. Social media was ruthless. People dissected every second of the debate. Memes flooded in. David's awkward silence. It became an instant GIF. Even mainstream networks couldn't ignore it. Some called it a wake-up call for biased journalism. Others tried damage control, but the damage was already done. Meanwhile, Karoline's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Brilliant job. That was legendary. David's career is over. But Karoline wasn't focused on the noise. She knew this wasn't just about one debate. It was about something much bigger. A few days later, David finally responded in a written statement. He blamed misinformation and unfair tactics. But no one was buying it. Karoline. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The facts were already out there, and the people had already made up their minds.